Okay, so our handout has several statements from Sotoshu summarizing what is, the main doctrine. So it has a thing that it says, this is our main doctrine. But I've given you a couple of other clips of text from other Sotoshu related sources because I think they're all pointing to something. So we are all children of the Buddha and come into this world endowed with the Buddha mind or Bushin. However, failing to realize this, we live selfish, willful lives, causing much suffering. If we make repentance to the Buddha and take refuge in him, our minds will come to rest, our lives will experience harmony and light, and we will rejoice in being of service to society. We will also experience the deep faith that will allow us to stand up under any hardship. To discover happiness and a life worth living is the teaching of the Soto Zen school. That's what Sotoshu says that we are doing. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Does that feel like what we're doing here? So, it's focusing on several things, but as we look at the other two things, it's going to become clear kind of what the main points are. So second little clip here says, abiding by the true Dharma, singularly transmitted by the Buddha ancestors, the Sotoshu doctrine is to realize Shikantaza and Sokushin Zeibutsu, or the mind itself is Buddha. This comes from the Sotoshu Shukan, which is its constitution. So its constitution is sort of like its articles of incorporation or its bylaws or something, right? So if you are part of a nonprofit in North America, there's governance documents, right? There's articles of incorporation and bylaws and policies and stuff. So this is part of its governance, and it's focusing on Shikantaza and Sokushin Zeibutsu, which we'll come back to in a minute. This third piece, the Soto sect, is based on the teaching of Seiden no Buppo, authentic transmission of the Buddha Dharma. That should sound familiar. Which has been passed down from the founder of the sect to successive generations. It is based on the teaching of Zazen, and the peace of mind and body that is obtained by practicing Zazen is realized as the form of Buddha, Butsu no Sugata. So, these things, in addition to sort of mentioning authentic transmission again, we've talked about authentic transmission last time, all of these are pointing to two key teachings. One is Sokushin Zeibutsu, mind itself is Buddha. The second one, Igisoku Buppo Saho Kore Shu Shi. Dignified deportment is the Buddha Dharma, and etiquette is the principle or the tenet of our school. So we've run into these before, but it's really useful to know, in the eyes of Sotoshu, these are the two things that we're really focusing on. I think as Westerners, it can be kind of confusing. We are exposed to the entire world of Buddhism, the entire world of Japanese Buddhism. We're conflating that with things we think are important in the West, and we can kind of thrash around a little bit, right? Sometimes and think we don't really know what's the anchor, what's the important stuff. We tend to land on Zazen. Zazen is everything. As long as we're doing Zazen, we don't need to do anything else. And we tend to land on Dogen. Somehow he's been centralized. We know how, but somehow he's been centralized. And we kind of think, well, if it's one of these two things, then that's it, and there's nothing else. Or we kind of don't know what to make of this soup of teachings. So I think it's really interesting to go look and sort of ask Sotoshu, what's important here? What does the denomination think is important? These two things, Sokushin Zeibutsu, Igisoku Buppo Saho Kore Shushi. So mind itself is Buddha. We could spend a week, 8 hours a day, on mind itself is Buddha. Clearly we can't. So I'm going to say a few things about that, but let me just say, when we're done here, or maybe tomorrow, I have a summary sheet that I have written about this, which I actually use for my own students, my ordaining students. I'm going to post that on the Buddhist Essentials page under this main doctrine sort of drop down so that everyone can read it. You can get the summary of it. You could spend your lifetime, and I hope you will, digging into mind itself is Buddha. But rather than read you that sheet, I'm just going to say, I'm going to post that. Please go out and get it. You can hang on to that and use it. So the mind, in mind itself is Buddha, is not the everyday thinking mind of the individual. We know that partly because mind here is capitalized, right? Mind is not a 100% good translation of Shin, but in this case, mind, right? So mind is the action of experiencing this moment in the most direct, the most authentic, simple, pure way. We are taking small self out of that equation. That's why it's a large capital M mind, right? This is not small self mind. This is experiencing this moment and this moment and this moment and this moment in the most direct way without our thought coverings, our opinions, our judging, our labeling, right? So experiencing this moment before discriminative thinking kicks in before we start writing the story about it, right? So in that moment, there's no person experiencing something. This should be familiar to us as well, right? So we've taken out the separation, the subject-object, right, separation. So there's just this completely interpenetrated activity. Sometimes we call it total dynamic functioning. The universe, I sometimes call it the universe doing what the universe does. There's activity happening, but we're not separating it, breaking it into, there's an I that's experiencing something. There's an I that's writing a story, right? There's just this total functioning. So Dogen says that the absolute Buddha treasure, remember we've talked about the three treasures, absolute, maintaining, and manifesting. He says the absolute Buddha treasure, or awakening itself, is the Buddha of this Sokushin Butsu. This is the Buddha we're talking about. So there can only be one boundless awakening, right, in the total functioning of the universe, rather than there's an individual state of some kind or an individual experience, peak experience or something like that, right? There is this total dynamic functioning, which is this boundless awakening. So because mind is just the functioning of the true reality of all beings. In other words, the universe doing what the universe does, right? It's just the true reality of all beings. If that's the case, then aspiration, practice, awakening, nirvana, if that's your stream, right, are not sequential things. This is not a linear path. I have bodhicitta, arouse bodhicitta, arouse some aspiration. I do some kind of practice. I have some experience called awakening, and then I leap off the wheel, right, and land in nirvana. According to Dogen, that is not a linear thing. Those things are all arising together. So this is the basis for Dogen's famous teaching that practice and awakening are not two. That we can't actually separate practice and awakening because all of this functioning is happening together. So I think my experience of thinking about this or studying this, I think that it has more to do with changing our understanding of the nature of awakening than our changing our understanding of the nature of practice. When we sort of want to approach this practice and awakening or not too, it's not about changing what we think about practice, it's changing what we think about awakening, I think. We know what it is to carry out practice, right? We think we do. We come, we sit down, we do zazen, we do work practice, we study texts, we do some liturgy, some ritual, right? It never occurs to us, I think, that awakening is not something we go out and get. That when we come to practice, we feel like I'm going to be struck by lightning and achieve something, get something that I don't have now. Somehow this is something which is separate from me. We don't feel awakened in this moment. It feels like awakening is not here. Awakening is there, and I have to go there, or I have to reach something, right? We need to shift our thinking about awakening. So, when all we're feeling is our delusion and our suffering and our karmic stuff in this body, it can feel like we're distant somehow from awakening. And yet, the functioning of the universe, including this one, we can't ever leave ourselves out of that equation. The total functioning of the universe, including this one, in this moment is already Buddha. It's already awakening, right? So what this Sokushin Butsu was pointing us to is an absolute view of something. It's not separate from the world of form, right? But can we shift our thinking about what Buddha is and what awakening is, right? And not worry quite so much about what is the practice that's going to get me to that place. So, as I say, I'll post the handout. Please go out and look at that, and you can really dig into Sokushin Butsu. The other thing we need to talk about then is this dignified deportment, this Igisoku Buppo piece. What is this piece about dignified deportment? Where it says the peace of Zazen is realized or manifested or embodied or something as the form of Buddha. So, one of the two things we know, Dogen wanted to bring back to Japan from China. When he went to China to do his training, because he was looking for something, and he meets his true teacher, Tendo Nyojo, and has his awakening experience, and decide, he's going to come back to Japan and bring this practice back. We know there's two things that he wants to bring back. One is the teachings that he learned from his teacher. The other is the Chinese monastic container. So, he had some things to say about deportment on that basis, right? How do we function in a monastic container? So he has some things to say both from the point of view of the daily specifics, because we know he writes about how to use the toilet, How do you take a bath? How do you wash your face? How do you cook a meal? He talks about those things, and he's also talking about it from this point of absolute reality. So we also need to remember the context for his writings about deportment. He was pretty unimpressed by the laxity that he saw in temples around him. He's looking at what these monks are doing, and we know he could be pretty critical when he wanted to be. He called a spade a spade. So he was kind of unimpressed by what he saw in these temples that were full of people who had become monks really looking for free food and a place to live. It happens, right? These are people who were kind of looking for an easy life. That is not the way Dogen approached practice. So he's kind of unimpressed by all of that. So in his own temple, he established fairly high standards for behavior, for deportment, for practice, moral behavior, serious dedication, right, to Buddha's way. The goal being that his temple was actually going to be able to embody this practice that he learned in China. So to manifest it, to realize it, to carry it out, and to pass it on. The reason he thought the monastic container was so important is he said, this is how this practice is going to go forward. This is where it's going to be, this is where we're going to really immerse ourselves in it and embody it in such a way that it's going to live beyond this generation. Because, of course, we know authentic transmission, right, was really important for him. So we might think this is two strange things that he brought back. On the one hand, these very abstract kind of teachings from his teacher, and on the other hand, this really concrete, how do you go to the toilet, practice instructions. We just think it's like he's two different guys. If you look at his writings, some are very specific and some are really out there, and you just think, how do these things come together? And this is how they come together. The deportment is how this is how the practice is going to be carried forward. So so he wrote these detailed instructions about how to carry out our daily practices, everything from brushing our teeth to chanting sutras. He had some very specific things to say, and also how to behave in various situations with different people. How do you meet seniors who are above you in the practice or more experienced than you in the practice, right? So he had very specific things to say. How we conduct ourselves when we are walking down the hall, or brushing our teeth, washing our face, is just as important as how we conduct ourselves during Zazen, or when we're doing a memorial, doing some liturgy. The teaching is not that the world is going to end if we don't do these particular things in a certain way. If your gasho is not, here, the world's going to end. That's not the point of his teachings. It's that each of our daily activities is not different from Zazen. It is nothing other than Zazen. It's the same Zazen mind, whether we're cooking a meal or emptying the cat box or putting on a robe or sitting Zazen. So all of those things are complete manifestations of Buddha nature. So Dogen says that awakening is nothing other than eating rice and drinking tea. All right. So our simple daily activities and the way we carry those out is important. I've heard this phrase, Igisoka Buppo Sahokore Shushi, summarized as what we do is important and how we do it is important, if you want a simple way to think about that. What we do is important and the way we do it is also important. So the content of our deportment, if you will, what we're actually doing or saying or making or creating, in some ways is less important than the enactment of Buddha nature itself. And I think one way we can think about that, I think that's how we can sort of wrestle with this idea that every activity we do is not different from Zazen. So the content of what I'm doing, whether I'm cooking a meal or I'm washing a dish or I'm cutting the grass, walking the dog, the content of that in some ways is not as important as how I'm embodying Buddha nature in that moment. Am I doing that thing with attention? Am I carrying out precepts when I'm doing it? Am I, sort of letting go of small self? How am I carrying out that moment by moment activity? So it's the unhindered way that universal functioning goes on rather than the specifics or the outcome of that activity. So for instance, we have people sewing robes at the moment, right? Yes, they're going to come out the end of that process with a robe. And as we talked about this morning, the process of sewing that robe is an enactment of something, and that is also important. So whether or not the stitches are crooked is a thing, and also the way we conduct the practice of creating that robe is also important. So enactment rather than attainment is a way that we can think about that. What are we enacting? It's the same mind that we use when we say Zazen is good for nothing, right? The act of doing Zazen is important. So, enactment rather than attainment. So the conduct of the Dharma talk or the chanting, perhaps rather than what gets said. The cooking rather than the meal, the outcome, right? The washing rather than the clean dishes. We're always hearing things like, we don't wash dishes to have clean dishes. We wash dishes to wash dishes. And yet, in the world of form, we need clean dishes. We don't want to get sick, right? And yet, in the world of form, what I say in a Dharma talk is important. So we get to carry both of these things. We need to not forget one side or the other side. So by emulating or enacting or repeating the conduct of Buddhas and ancestors and senior practitioners, we learn with the body. This is a lot of what we do in the training temple. Westerners arrive in the training temple and they want checklists and handouts and why are we doing this? And that's not the way learning happens, right? They simply say, ring this bell, hit this hon, move here, do this, go like that. And it's not about we're going to do an intellectual analysis of why we're doing things. We're there really to learn with the body. So a way of entering into that space of awakening with our seniors, with Buddhas and ancestors, is to emulate their conduct. Take on the characteristics of an awakened being. So we move like they do. We say what they said. We practice the way they practiced. We're enacting something. Even if we don't 100% totally get it. There's something about being on that, taking on that form, right? Which is important. So at first we might be intentionally copying people. You might look at what a senior does, what your teacher does, what a Buddha does, and we're sort of intentionally copying them and knowing I'm copying them. I'm not generating this myself. I'm simply copying what somebody else is doing. At some point, though, our deportment becomes an expression of our own awakening. If we do it enough, we get it into our bones and marrow, right? It becomes an expression of our own awakening. So behaving like Buddhas and ancestors means sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. These are the four sort of activities or actions of the body, right? Sitting, standing, walking, lying down. Are we doing that like Buddhas and ancestors? Right? It's an interesting practice. If we're doing that, we're acting skillfully, we're promoting wholesomeness, we're discouraging unwholesomeness. Sounds familiar, right? When we talked about the 3 pure precepts. We're taking that on and doing that with this karmic body. So there's this really interesting intersection happening here. Something absolute is happening, and it's happening with this very specific karmic being. So we get to live in that intersection. But Dogen tells us several times in the Zuimonki, if we want to practice the way, we should conduct ourselves the way Buddhists conduct themselves without any expectation of reward. So again, we're in this not for some kind of gain. And again, we're back to practice and awakening or not to. So we can see how these two teachings, Soku Shinzei Butsu and this Igisoku Butpo, we can see how they're both pointing to something about this practice and awakening or not to. We're not practicing to get something later on, which is not here now, that we don't already have, and we're not minding our manners in order to avoid showing disrespect, which is really interesting because when we think about conduct, deportment, being polite, usually we would take that on in some way that's about not being disrespectful or about showing respect. And certainly when we're in an environment like this, we feel like we should be respectful. New people are often worried about doing something which will be taken as disrespect. It can't be, because if you've never been here before, you wouldn't know what to do, right? So we're coming at it at this kind of level that's about social acceptance or not making people angry. And it's not that that's not important, it's that that's not the whole story, because that's an outcome. Right? That's taking on deportment as a means for something. And there's also this there's also this aspect of deportment which is not about that, which is simply enacting Buddha nature, or acting like Buddha. So I think it's really an interesting layer. It's an interesting aspect of this teaching, right? So our deportment is completely the Buddha living out the life of Buddha. So whether or not we're wearing one of these things, right? Our deportment is completely Buddha living out the life of Buddha. We are already Buddha. It's not something we're doing for the sake of something else. And we keep hearing this teaching, right? And this is yet another way that that's manifesting for us. So this is undertaking the way for the sake of the way, if you will. We hear about this in Zuimonki and in other places, right? This is why, late in his life, Dogen starts to favor this monastic container over lay life. Not that lay people themselves are incapable. It's not about the people, it's about the container, right? In his world, there was lay life and a monastic container. In our world in North America, that's very much hybrid. Our practice here is very much a mixture of what was, Dogen and others doing in the container and what were lay people doing. This is really sort of an unprecedented mix, hybrid, right? So I think what we can take from his interest in that monastic container for today is he's interested in, seriously practicing in some way which has some concern for our deportment, for forms. So, temple container reinforces our commitment to that kind of deportment, right? All our energy goes into practice. If you're not, so if imagine you're a monk in a temple, right, in Japan or in Dogen's day, all your energy is going into practice, right? Rather than being distracted by family responsibilities, running a business, tilling the fields, right, doing the things that are outside of the temple kind of in lay life. So again, not a comment on the people, it's a comment on the practice circumstance, right? Temple life is ideal because there are expectations for conduct. Everybody agrees who lives in the temple, this is the way we're going to behave. And there are not the distractions of outside things. So our conduct is reflected back to us in a sort of a closed loop in a kind of an interesting way. So I think that's where he's going with that. So this is a teaching, I think, that encourages us to ask ourselves, who is it that's carrying out this dignified deportment? In other words, what's the nature of the self in all of this thing? So next week in this group, we go back to reading Toto San's article about the structure of the self. I think this is in some ways asking us to investigate, is there a me that's sitting up straight, that's wearing robes in a certain way, that's doing a ceremony a certain way, that's not coming into the Zendo chewing gum, with a toothpick hanging out of your mouth and slouching around, right? I mean, what is happening here? This is another gateway, I think, into that investigation in a kind of an interesting way. So, if I'm already Buddha, if I'm not trying to get something, then how do I act, right? The question is, how does a Buddha act? How does a Buddha move through the world? If there's no me in here that's getting something out of that, like what does that look like, right? How do you function in this moment, not in the abstract, but with what we're doing, with this body and mind, like right now? How do we walk through a room? How do we open a door? How do we handle objects? How do we talk to people? How does a Buddha do that? Like, how does a Buddha get in the car and turn the key? It's a really interesting sort of moment-by-moment question. Am I just doing things to sort of go through the motions? Am I not really investigating what's happening? Am I doing things to shore up my ego, right? We have a million chances in a day to say, what is this Buddha doing with this body and mind? So if we're paying attention, we're conducting ourselves as Buddha, moment by moment by moment. Now, interestingly, that can't be what we think Buddha is. We could be conducting ourselves in a way which is about my idea of Buddha. This has to go beyond that, right? Every moment is an opportunity to manifest that Buddha nature with some kind of intention. So, if we're the ones carelessly slouching around, hands in the pockets, robes on crooked, sitting sprawled out in the Zendo, feet toward Buddha, right? We're kind of missing the mark. We're missing an opportunity with our deportment to really, in this moment, pay attention. To pay attention to this moment, right, is not the dignified conduct of practice and ancestors, of Buddhas and ancestors. So like, what's going on there, right? So I think that's what that phrase or that teaching is pointing us to, right? So we have, I think, for main doctrine, we've got two things we can investigate. Again, these are lifelong investigations. One is Soku Shinsei Butsu. Mind itself is Buddha. What is mind? What is Buddha? How are they connected? And also, what are we doing with this karmic body and mind to embody the way Buddhas and ancestors are?